Forgetting the Self, a commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, Book 1, Sutra 4, which is part of a comparative study course by Dr. Lisa Love, using the wisdom from 3 different books. B.K.S. Iyengar's Light on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, Sri Swami Satchidananda's The Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, and Alice Bailey's The Light of the Soul, also on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali. So let's review the 3 sutras as interpreted from the Sanskrit by our 3 authors, starting with Sri Swami Satchidananda. At other times, the self appears to assume the forms of mental modifications. Here's what B.K.S. Iyengar has to say. At other times, the seer identifies with the fluctuating consciousness. And Alice Bailey's interpretation, sometimes it's interesting how different they are. Up till now, the inner man has identified himself with his forms and with their active modifications. So that's how our 3 authors see the sutra differently. So I will give you my simple interpretation of it, and that is, in essence, the sutra is saying that you are the self, and you are always that self. You always have been it, you will be it, and you can never not be it. That's the truth. But in our everyday conscious awareness, in terms of our brain conscious awareness, which some people call the local self, we have either forgotten or we keep forgetting who we really are as that self. We get caught up in what is known as the mental modifications and succumb to the mental chatter, emotional reactions, physical lethargy, materialism, and more that prevents us from remembering who we really are as the peaceful self. And the Yoga Sutras teach us the methods by which we will stop forgetting who we are so that we can remain in the glorious splendor of that self at all times. So let's look at what Sri Swami Satchidananda has to say. And remember, I'm only doing a short summary of each one of these books. It's too long for me to do the whole thing. So do get the books and read what our authors have to say in total for yourself. I'm giving you just tidbits. So here are some key thoughts. Sri Swami Satchidananda discusses how the self appears to lose itself in the variety of forms it assumes. And he says, here's a quote, "That is why if we could calm our minds and get to the basis of these modifications, we would find the unity among everything. This is the real yogic life. That does not mean we are indifferent to the changes and become useless to the world. Instead, with the experience of unity, we function better." End of quote. So what we learn how to do when we are that peaceful self, and as we abide in that self, we learn to kind of watch these modifications, the mind, the emotions, what happens physically in the world. We watch it more as the observer without getting caught up in it. And yet at the same time, we're not indifferent to what's happening out there. We learned to stand at the seat of the self and to direct what's happening out there from that seat, which creates more of a sense of unity. Let's read his second quote. "That means behind all these ever-changing phenomena is a never-changing one. That one appears to change due to our mental modifications. So by changing your mind, you change everything." End of quote. And if you read the book by Sri Swami Satchidananda, you'll really get this sense that a key thing here is to change your perceptions, change how you interpret, change how you're framing. You can reframe it, to use a neurolinguistic programming word, so that it reminds you of the sense of unity, so that you see deeper into what's going on behind the ever-changing phenomena. So let's start again by reintroducing our model that we've been using. And as you see, these are the 3 levels of the ego, or the ahamkara as it's known, which has to do with the mental plane, which is also known as chitta, sometimes spelled C-I-T-T-A, manas and mind, which all 3 of our authors use that. The emotional plane, which Alice Bailey sometimes calls the psychic nature, desire mind, and the physical plane. So there are 3 different levels that comprise the ego. Then there are the self or spiritual levels, which are comprised of the Buddhic and Atmic planes. And that is the self that we abide in when we stay at that level of consciousness. And one of the ways that we learn how to abide in that is that we move through what is often known as the soul or the causal body, the body of causes. And this is also known as the egoic lotus. It can be the mystic rose in the Christian tradition. And as these petals unfold of this flower, it symbolically helps us shift our consciousness from ego, individualistic, selfish concerns to selfless, non-individualistic, based upon a sense of unity and deeper expression of that unity in the world. So we go through this process through what's also known as the Antakarana or the Rainbow Bridge. And as we do that, we learn to abide within the self. In Buddhism, that's called calm abiding. We learn to abide permanently within this level of the Atmic and Buddhic planes. But it doesn't really go like that most of the time. In fact, what happens is we kind of start to get there maybe in peak experiences, or we have a high that lifts us up, and then we fall back down and it's blocked again. Or maybe it's blocked entirely. So we get there, we don't get there, then we get there, we don't get there. It's more of a ebb and flow that happens here. And that's what's also called the remembering and the forgetting. We remember who we are as the self, we forget who we are and go back and be the selfish ego. We go from selfless to selfish until eventually it stabilizes. But one of the reasons why it doesn't stabilize is we get caught up in the modifications of the mind. We get distracted by the emotional impulses and by getting reattached to the physical brain and the physical world and the physical body. And that pushes us back down from the level of the self that we are into forgetting it and going back into the ego. So now that we've reviewed our model again, let's look at what Iyengar has to say. And he interprets the Sanskrit as saying, at other times the seer identifies with the fluctuating consciousness. And here are some quotes from him. First of all, when the seer identifies with consciousness or with the object seen, he unites with them and forgets his grandeur. So in the previous slide, that was when the arrow goes down, the little X happens, and we once again are identifying with the consciousness of the object seen, the mind, the emotions, the physical world, and we're forgetting our grandeur, which was the previous Sutra 3, talks about the self abiding in its grandeur. We forget our grandeur as the self. Here's another quote. Chitta projects itself, taking on the form of the objects in order to possess them. Thus it becomes enveloped by thoughts of the object, with the result that the soul is obscured. In this way, the chitta becomes murky and causes changes in behavior and mood as it identifies with the thing seen. So think of the slide we just saw again. And what happens is the mind projects itself and starts to get caught up in mental thoughts, caught up in emotional reactions, caught up in wanting to possess material objects. It is enveloped by the thoughts of the objects, obsessed with money, sex, power, the things of the world, and the soul, the self, is obscured. Now, the soul can be used in different ways here. It can be the self on the Atmic and Buddhic planes, or it can be that causal body, that egoic lotus that we call the soul in another model of it. Either way, our chitta, our minds, become murky, and we don't think straight. We get more emotionally reactive. We don't make wise choices in the world of effects. We don't use our material objects and possessions in a way that is based upon a sense of unity. Instead, we use them selfishly and constantly move into wanting to acquire and grasp. And because of that, we're no longer drawing from the sense of unity that comes from the soul and the self. We're no longer drawing from that sense of inner peace and clarity and illumination, understanding, and compassion. Another quote, worked upon by the desires and fears of turbulent worldly life, it becomes cloudy, opaque, even dirty and scarred, and prevents the soul's light from shining through it. lacking inner illumination, it seeks all the more avidly the artificial lights of conditioned existence. And later he says yoga counters this. So let's just call that for now the ego. Our selfish desires. The ego, when that X happens in the previous slide and the arrow pushes it down, is now caught up in turbulent worldly life. And it's seeking and grasping and desiring and afraid of losing, which is going to be talked about in sutras that are to follow this one. And because of that, the access to the soul's light is blocked. It no longer shines through. It becomes cloudy. Opaque is similar to cloudy. Dirty, scarred. This is the ego becomes this because it can no longer access the soul's light. It becomes rusty in a way because it doesn't have that inner illumination. And it is instead getting caught up in what are known as artificial lights, not the real light, the solar light, but the artificial lights of what he calls conditioned existence, limitations in thought, limitations in belief, limited emotional reactiveness, limited desire to possess things that ultimately are going to be taken away, especially at death. So you can see the problems here that Iyengar is talking about when we get caught up in these things. So, if you notice, the interpretation by Alice Bailey is really different than our other authors, and in part that's because she's not giving a literal interpretation of the Sanskrit. She's choosing to give the essential meaning of the Sanskrit. And actually, I've read 10 different versions of the Yoga Sutras, a number of them many times, but I prefer using this version because in her essentializing the meaning, she actually has a lot to say, and a lot of it makes a lot of sense and has really helped me grasp the Yoga Sutras, especially when it comes to Book 3 and Book 4. So let's look at what she has to say. First of all, and you really need to read her interpretation, I'm giving you a summary here, she's saying that these mental modifications hide the Christ within. Now, she wrote in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. She comes from a Christian perspective, but when she talks about the Christ within, she's meaning the same thing as what some call the Atman, some call the Buddhic nature, that's like Hinduism and Buddhism. And it's, if you go back to that slide we had just a few slides ago, it's that essential self that resides on the Atmic and Buddhic planes, which are levels of consciousness where we are thinking and feeling and behaving with a certain level of understanding that's primarily a level of unity. And she says the goal is to free yourself from the mental modifications, or lower forms, as she refers to them, so you can become the soul or stand within the fullness of Christ consciousness. Now, in her model, we had that little egoic lotus, that little soul, causal body. That represents stages of evolution before you come into the fullness of what she calls Christ consciousness, what is also known as the Atman, your Buddhic nature, the Atmic and Buddhic planes. You can see the parallels amongst different spiritual traditions here. So how do we move through the levels of soul unfoldment, unfold the petals of the lotus or the mystic rose in the Christian tradition? How do we unfold this to stand in Christ consciousness? Well, she says the way to do this is through, and now here's an exact quote from her, the concentrated effort of the soul to hold steadily the position of the observer or perceiver and of seer. When we are able to do this, the lower spectacle of the rapidly changing forms of thought and desire fades away, and the realm of the soul, the true field of soul knowledge, can be seen and contacted. And she means this first and foremost by unfolding these different stages of the soul before we get to the Atmic and Buddhic planes. To let you know, the lotus or the rose, whichever way you want to interpret it, has 12 petals, and each petal represents a stage of spiritual unfoldment that we have to go through in our consciousness before we can truly cross the rainbow bridge, the Antakarana, and be anchored in Christ consciousness, our Buddhic nature, in the Atman, in those levels of the self, the seer. I hope you're starting to get a synthesis of understanding with these books, and also it can help you get a synthesis as you approach different spiritual traditions. You're going to start to see the similarities more than the differences. All right, so as we continue, I'm going to clear up something in this particular sutra explanation that has to do with the difference between the observer and the observed, which is going to be really important as we follow along in sutras to come. So let's talk first about what is the observed. Well, essentially, the observed is the ego, or what I'm calling here the avatar. Now, this word avatar has nothing to do with some super illuminated spiritual being, the way the word is used in the East. Instead, we're using it in a totally different way, how it's used in the West, in regarding to video games. And if you've played video games or you've seen the blockbuster movie Avatar, you understand that when you play a video game, in many of them, you can create a representation of yourself. That's known as an avatar. And that avatar can be male, female, different skin colors, different eyes, nose, mouth. You can make it heavier, short, tall, thin. You can even make it an alien being. You can even make it a cat or dog, whatever you want to make it. You can, in many video games, create your avatar in all kinds of different ways, and it represents you. And when you play the game, you are not the avatar in the game. You are the observer of it, observing the avatar in the video game. Let's look at it another way. So here, the avatar is inside the screen. It's inside the video game, and you are observing it. The observed is inside the video game. That's where the avatar lives, the representation of you, and the observer is you outside watching the game. In a similar way, Lisa Love, for example, is an avatar, and the self, the peaceful self, the true self, is the observer. That's a tough concept for people to get because we're so used to thinking that we are just the ego, the separated self, the mind, the emotions, and the body. We don't know that in truth we are the self, the observer. We are not the observed, we are the observer. We are the self. So that's important to understand. And what makes us forget that we're the self, forget that we're the observer, is we get so caught up in what's going on in that movie or that video game or the external world that we live in, or our thoughts, feelings, and physical emotion, that we forget. The modifications disrupt and we forget who we really are as the self, the observer, the Christ within, the Christ consciousness, the Buddhic nature, the Atma, whatever you call it. We no longer are conscious of who we are. So that is the essential commentary on Book 1, Sutra 4. And as with all these sutras, I'm creating a meditation to help you practice it. So I encourage you to find the meditation, Forgetting and Remembering. And if you are taking this study course, here are the instructions of how to take it, followed by a little bit about who I am and how to contact me if you want to get one-on-one instruction or start this course along with me or with others.